So here I go with another hot take, if you will, when it comes to American politics. By that I mean it's not really a hot take, but that's okay. So this is about Tulsi Gabbard's town hall that she just had on Sunday, March 10th. And first off, I'm surprised that she got a town hall, kind of. Not entirely, because most of the other Democratic candidates have had one so far, so they would look kinda silly if they didn't give her one. Now, that's not to say that things weren't necessarily slanted against her, but I do think it's important to probe candidates on their views, regardless of whether or not you support them. No one's immune to criticism. I don't support the Democratic Party at all. And I think Tulsi Gabbard is one of the best Democrats that there is, and one of the best politicians that we've had in quite some time. Now, the bar is low. That's not to say that she doesn't deserve credit for her foreign policy stances. She absolutely does. And her domestic stances are pretty solid as well. And as a gay lady, I mean, her voting record is pretty solid in my opinion, but that's just my opinion, and you don't have to take my word as gospel. Obviously you won't, and you shouldn't. Anyway, I don't script this shit. That's pretty obvious, so sorry about that. But I think she did pretty well with her town hall. I think her composure is outstanding. I think she comes across as fairly authentic compared to most politicians. Most of them seem like they're manufactured in some kind of weird factory. Like, I don't know, like Kamala Harris is like a Hillary Clinton 2.0, like fused with Obama. Like, if you think back to Dragon Ball Z, when there's like a fusion dance, it's like Hillary and Obama doing a fusion dance, and then Kamala Harris emerges. And in my opinion, that's fairly unfortunate. However, Tulsi comes across as a lot more authentic, and I think that's a huge strength of hers. And I think her composure is a huge strength of hers. But I think there's one question in this town hall that her answer, it wasn't bad, and I agree with her answer. However, how it was articulated might be used against her to some degree, because it's a sensitive subject for some people. Okay, so here is the recording of it, but it's probably going to sound like shit, so sorry about that in advance.
Came after your fellow Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar suggested that support for Israel in Congress is, quote, all about the Benjamins, and criticized lawmakers just this past week for supporting Israel as potentially having, quote, allegiance to a foreign country. What do you think about these statements, and do you think this is anti-Semitic?
Well, let's look at the bigger issue here. The bigger issue is, there's a couple actually, of making sure that as members of Congress and as people in this country, we can have open dialogue about our foreign policy. As our criticisms levied about dual loyalty, again, as I mentioned in the last question, I've been on the receiving end of those types of attacks, so I can understand how offensive they can be. Where just because I am a Hindu, people assume that therefore I must be loyal to some other interest or some other place.
But what about these specific statements? You're talking broadly. These specific statements, were they anti-Semitic?
There are people who have expressed their offense at these statements. I think that what Congresswoman Omar was trying to get at was a deeper issue related to our foreign policy. And I think there's an important discussion that we have to be able to have openly, even though we may end up disagreeing at the end of it, that we've got to be able to have that openness to have the conversation.
But you're not willing to go as far as saying it's anti-Semitic.
Is what she was trying to bring up was something that was a deeper issue. Okay. And I don't believe that her intent was to cause any offense to anyone.
Okay, let's...
Now, I don't think that I'm going to provide you with a lot of original critique on comments that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar made regarding AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and its influence in American politics. Now, this has been in the media fairly prominently for like the last month or so. So I'm sure that you've heard a lot about it, you have your own opinions, and you're welcome to those. The only thing I have to say on that front is that I don't disagree with Congresswoman Omar's comments because I look at it through the lens of capital. And I think Tulsi Gabbard's comments would have been much better accentuated and explained, in my opinion, if she were to describe things looking at it through the lens of capital. Now, this is just my opinion and my take on it, and that doesn't mean that I'm right, but I'm a nerd and I like to read and I do a lot of that. And so based on the things that I've read in various books, academia, all these sorts of things over the years, this is the conclusion that I am led to look at things through typically. Now, this doesn't mean I'm right. You're welcome to challenge my perspective, and I am welcome to a challenge, of course. But I think that it's important to look at influence of capital in American politics, regardless of what lobby it comes from. And if you confront this quote-unquote controversy through the lens of capital, I think it diminishes the controversy to some degree. Now, I am not a Jewish American. I'm not Jewish in general. I'm not an Israeli. I'm just like a sad white girl or whatever. So I don't know how these kinds of accusations may personally affect someone who is a Jewish American or is an Israeli, these sorts of things. I know these are certain tropes that tend to be potentially offensive depending on how they're leveled and what accusations are leveled just in general. My take from it is that it is not an accusation against the Jewish people as a whole. I mean, I think it's kind of indisputable that that's not anything that was said ever. And I mean, you could try and twist it that way if you so choose, if it's expedient for you. But for my take on it is it's a critique of capital and how capital influences American politics and how basically our Congress and our political system as a whole, all branches of them, all three, are open to influence from capital, and that's an issue. And it must be analyzed, it must be discussed, and it must be at the forefront of political discussion, in my opinion, because capital shapes how politics occur in the United States. And if you don't discuss this, then I don't think it's reasonable to be able to assess what is occurring in politics in the United States in general. Capital has an undue influence in American politics largely because of the 2008 Citizens United Supreme Court case ruling, which more or less ruled that money is the equivalent of free speech. And so this has more or less positively, or I guess made illegal or positively sanctioned the idea of capital influencing politicians, which has been a very long occurring thing in the US. I mean, the precursor to Citizens United in 2008 was the Buckley versus Vallejo case, which was decades prior, so that kind of laid some of the foundation for it. So this isn't necessarily a new concept. However, it's very blatant and very in our faces, because I think it's fair to say that any lobby, any industry that has money has a lobby. I mean, I don't really know how that's particularly disputable. So you've got fossil fuels, you've got pharmaceutical, you've got the insurance industry. I mean, you've got a whole litany of things. And this influences our politicians because they donate to their campaigns. Because basically, if they don't have the money to run a campaign, they're not going to win. That tends to be the case. If you don't get exposure through the media, and you need money to be able to get exposure through the media, you tend to not win campaigns a lot. So capital influences politicians because they need to take money from people to be able to get exposure, to run a campaign, to successfully secure a seat. And then once they have a seat, I mean, unless you're super naive, and if you disagree with me, you're welcome to, but you don't just take money, a lot of it, from some mafia-esque type lobbying situation from a big industry, and they just give it to you because they're extra kind. Maybe that happens sometimes, but I don't know for sure. Like, I'm not like in Congress, obviously, so I can't say for positive, but I have my suspicions. So, of course, it's a quid pro quo, if you will. You take the money and you are expected to, it's an investment more or less. And the same can be said of any industry or any industry that lobbies politicians. And AIPAC does lobby politicians. And it's through more than just AIPAC. There are other organizations that exist that lobby congresspeople, such as CUFI, which is the Christians United for Israel. And the fact that they do this, well, is a fact. And they are legally allowed to do this. So it's not really disputing its legality. The legality is not what is up for debate, though I do not think it should be legal personally. The fact that they are available and open and willing and very adamant about lobbying congresspeople has an effect on American politics as a result, just as it does for any other industry. So I think that looking at things through the lens of capital is very important. Now, whether or not you want to level accusations of anti-Semitism against anyone who makes these comments, whether it be Congresswoman Omar, whether it be against Tulsi Gabbard, or myself even, like, I haven't gotten that one before, but, you know, if you want to make that accusation, like, sure, I disagree with you because I'm looking at it through the lens of capital. Now, whether or not you want to question somebody's motive, you're welcome to do so, and I don't think you're wrong for it. However, if you play devil's advocate, let's say that Congresswoman Omar or Tulsi Gabbard is anti-Semitic. Does that change the content and the actual reality of their critiques? Their argument is still important to consider, even if it were to be motivated by some kind of prejudice or hatred, which I do not believe that arguments that are presently active in politics in the last month about this issue, I don't think that they are backed by hatred. I think it is an important debate to be had. And some people, of course, are going to be motivated by hatred. Like, that is absolutely certain. You're going to get people that are very bigoted and have a lot of hatred for certain groups that are going to latch on to anything that they find expedient to their hatred or their bigotry. And while I personally find nothing more detestable than prejudice against a group of people simply because of who they are, their existence, and the fact that often the leading political class or the leading group who maintains hegemony, typically the wealthy, often need someone to oppress in order to maintain their hegemony. I find nothing more detestable than prejudice and hatred, in my opinion. I think it stems from bigotry, a misunderstanding, and a willingness to group everybody into the same kind of category. Lacks nuance and insight and, in my opinion, just any kind of reasonable perspective. But even if the critiques that are leveled are motivated by this, that is attacking the individual who is making a critique. Now, they might be a cunt, don't get me wrong. Sure, that's totally possible. Cunts are all over the place, dude. Well, that's not a good word. I really like cunts, so that's probably not the best word. Assholes, there we go. Not a huge fan, personally. If you like them, I'm not going to hate on you for it. Okay, so let's say the person is, like, for sure an asshole. It is still important to consider whether or not their critique holds any kind of water, even if they're an asshole. Because I guess in argumentation it's called ad hominem when you attack the individual's character who is making an argument or a critique. It's important to, while you can level them in some cases, and while it may motivate the critiques they're making, they might be a shitty person for sure. But they might still be making, unfortunately, while they might be an asshole or a horrible person, they might be making a critique that is somewhat valid, as much as you might not want to admit it. And whether or not that's applicable here is up to your interpretation. But attacking the person delivering an argument is a method of argumentation that can be done oftentimes if someone doesn't have a legitimate argument against the argument someone is making. So you attack the character of the person making it. And sure, it can work sometimes, and people who make arguments a lot of the time are just, like I said, assholes. Like, that goes without saying. But the content of their argument is what is important, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that everyone that is trying to have this discussion is colored by these prejudices. But even if they were, does this diminish the critique of capital and how it influences politicians? Is the question that I would pose to you. And I think that Tulsi's question that she was asked in her response, it wasn't bad. However, she is a Hindu woman, and as a not Hindu woman, I can't say what it would be like to be in the public eye as a minority religiously and ethnically, and how this would affect you and in the kind of bigotry that you would face. I can't profess to know that, and I don't try to. So I'm sure that Tulsi Gabbard has faced plenty of that in her time in politics. I don't dispute that. I do not know that it was necessarily appropriate to equivocate that with how Jewish people as a whole, whether religiously, ethnically, or both, have experienced that, because, again, I am not Jewish either. I know that this is an enduring kind of quote-unquote trope, if you will, that has followed Jewish people around for a long time, and that has been leveled against them. As for Hindu people, I cannot say. So I know that she was trying to have some kind of common ground and trying to reach out and say, I understand things leveled against you that don't make sense. I understand things leveled against you out of a person's misunderstanding or unwillingness to try to understand or to try to comprehend where you come from or your perspective or your motives. So I think that that's what she was reaching for, and I don't think she was wrong for that. But considering, I guess, the more prevalent narrative of Jewish persecution historically that we receive educationally in the United States when it comes to global historical occurrences, people tend to be more aware of the sufferings of Jewish people compared to that of Hindu people. I'm not trying to make an equivalence, and I'm not trying to say that someone has suffered more than another. I can't profess to know. I just know what I've learned history-wise, and I don't know that there is massive value in trying to say someone has suffered more than another if we can try to do what we can now in the present to try to diminish these sufferings. It's important to look at the history, to get some narrative and some idea and some background and some facts about what people have experienced, to understand what happened, what occurred, and to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I'm not advocating for anybody's suffering, and I'm not advocating for people being bigoted on any front, not by any means. But I'm not sure that she necessarily defended Congresswoman Omar's statements as well as she could have. I don't think she was wrong for defending them, of course. But I think coming from the perspective of critiquing capital and its influence in American politics is the most appropriate method to make the critique here. Because I think that the issue of capital is what it's all about on a lot of fronts, but especially when it comes to the influence of lobbies in general. And that's just my take on it. I think that, I really can't say, I think it was Tulsi's most unsure statement where it seemed like she was less articulate compared to her other statements she made in her town hall. And that's not to say that her statements are bad at all, but I can imagine the media trying to seize on this potentially, because I think that they were looking for a lot of gotcha statements from her, or anything that she would say they could seize on, make a soundbite, and turn against her, to try to demonize her because she is a threat to the ruling capitalist class and its hegemony because she doesn't support quote-unquote foreign policy that the U.S. has enacted for a century or more. She is against intervention and the seizing of a sovereign state's assets, whether it be oil, gold, what have you. And this is why she's so valuable in political discourse. And this is why anything that can be seized upon to make her look bad or be spun in a way that demonizes her is going to be especially important for corporate media. So I fear that people are going to say that she wasn't emphatic in her critique of what Omar said, or in how she articulated what she thought Omar said. So that's something to look out for. You don't have to agree with me. I'm always open to disagreement and any other perspective in general. I think it's important to discuss these things. So, okay, have a great week. See you later. Bye.